Wat nana bojo Anishinaabek dok nin so jik benendo dem shiging don jaba na now ing te we shkunagan. The reserve that I'm from is right in the center of Manitoulin Island. And the reason that I got into this whole thing about this wampum belt is Nui Nishnaabem, Nui Nata Nishnaabem. I wanted to learn to speak my language and I wanted to learn to speak it well, but I still can't. But besides that fact, what I ended up in my learning, I ended up looking at all kinds of different sources. I was learning, stock phrases, Anishna, that means how are you? And then they'd say Nishin, that you're good. Or Minamatis, you're living well. But I wanted to learn more than that. I thought I wanted to learn all of our old stories and how they're told in Anishinaabe, and that this is supposed to be how we would best express our Anishinaabe environmental ethic. So that was my reasoning at that point. So I recorded a number of elders and transcribed and translated what they said and then tried to understand that more fully. But through the course of my research, I ended up going to an archives in our community, and I found a letter written in Ojibwe in 1862 at our reserve called Chugwednong at that time. And when it was written in Ojibwe, I didn't really understand what it was about. And the main thing that I want to try and emphasize here, one of the main things that I want to try and emphasize is in a lot of institutions like this, not just University of Toronto, but York, any university, we all debate and contemplate and talk about and research and write what's called Aboriginal worldview or Indigenous worldview. But what I find we're missing in a lot of this discourse, just because we're just not there yet, is the role that language plays in that. And there's a whole frontier, if you want to call it that we haven't actually looked at in our language. So I found this text there, and it was translated already, and then I never knew what the Covenant Chain was about, so that led me to try and understand this further. And then each time I learn one thing, I have to find where it goes back and going back further and further and further. So then at the end, I end up not just talking about one belt, but many of these belts that I have. And this slide here shows the continuum. What I want to try to emphasize is that it wasn't just an event, and that the treaties are often treated as an event rather than a process. And that after 1764, part and parcel of that treaty was meeting every year with the British. And every year the British delivered presents to us, and every year they came to talk, and they called that polishing the chain. So if anything happened throughout that year, then you were to sit down and actually, what they would call polish the chain, but we could say now make things harmonious and smooth, the relationship, anything that had happened through the year. So the other thing that I want to emphasize is that for us, this didn't come without a struggle. That people died so that we have something. That people stood up, namely Chief Pontiac, Odawa Chief Pontiac, as well as Seneca Chief Girashota, stood up, and they took a stand so that we actually have something here today to talk about. Because the British were willing to run roughshod over the whole country, and that was actually their perspective, that they had conquered the French. They thought they conquered us as well. But it was these chiefs that stood up and said, you conquered the French, but not us. So the other thing that I wanted to, when I was first invited to talk, they said the Lieutenant Governor was going to be here. So the way I kind of shaped this talk was to look at each successive Lieutenant Governor once that institution was instilled here in Upper Canada, that I wanted to show when these guys, the Lieutenant Governor in the capacity as a representative of the Crown, actually gave belts to us as well. And the other thing that I want to mention is off the hop, that these subsequent wampum belts do not diminish the principles set out in the first 1764 belt, nor do they abrogate or derogate in any way anything that was transacted at Niagara at that time. And in fact, they actually strengthen it. And each of the lieutenant governors go on to say that, I give you this belt to strengthen my words. So these are various representations of that, and throughout the presentation, I hope to, if I get through it in 40 minutes, to explain what each of these are about. So for us, when we talk about a treaty, we look at Anishinaabe perspective, and of course now you hear a lot of the discourse in the mass media as well as in scholarship as spirit and intent, as well as looking at our understanding. So for us, when you look at all these speeches, I put all these speeches together. Whenever they had a council, they would talk about sometimes they wouldn't explicitly talk about the belt, but they would just talk about getting together and what their relationship was. And this occurred every year. And you see at the bottom here with this particular belt, when Sir William Johnson gave this represents, when it's on its own, a hexagon on its own usually represents a council fire. And there were designated council fires between the British and the Anishinaabe, and those council fires were places of meeting as well as places to give and receive the presence or the enactment of the treaty. So down here for us on the Western Confederacy, it's actually the Fort Detroit at that time, as well as Fort Michilimackinac. Then for the Eastern Confederacy, it's Fort Niagara, where the treaty was given, and then probably Johnson's house, and then the other one would be Montreal as well. So these are actual specific places designated where you're actually going to receive your presents. One thing, I was talking the other day, last week actually, about the belts, and this belt is usually called a peace and friendship belt. And I was talking to this person, I just said, I don't know why I detest that designation so much. And I just feel like it diminishes the role of this belt, that it isn't just about peace and friendship. It makes it sound kind of lame. And the person I was talking to, I thought was funny because she ended up saying, yeah, it makes it sound like you got two BFF bracelets, and these are best friends forever. But that's what this is. Actually, they do say we tied our hands together in the bonds of friendship with wampum. So it does say that. But this belt to us actually means more than that. It actually means our independence and that we weren't subjugated by the British. And it also is our Aboriginal title or our land ownership. And it's also our protection, or what now we call fiduciary responsibility. It's also our support, but back then what they called our warmth. And so the Anishinaabe chiefs, whenever they would get up and talk about this, they would say, we expect to receive our warmth again next year. And they're talking about the blankets, the cloth that were given at that time, and also the rum. But the other thing that they said at that time was they made a fire. So the council fire, to draw warmth from the council fire as well. But it also, I think we ended up making a bit of a mistake by tying in payment for past services. So when we fought alongside the British during the American War of Independence, and then during the War of 1812, and then afterward this started being the annual treaty, ended up taking on tones of payment for past services. And then that's when they started saying, after a while, the lieutenant governor or the superintendent of Indian Affairs started saying, well, you have been paid long enough for your services during the late war. But that really wasn't what this was about. So there's a book I recommend. I read it. It's pretty, I needed a dictionary beside me. It's a philosopher named Bruce Morito. He had written this book, An Ethic of Mutual Consent, and it's about the covenant chain. But one thing that I like that I just wanted to show, he put the words that I was struggling with. So I always thought, we always approach this Treaty of Niagara as a static time event frozen in time. But I want to demonstrate that this is an example of what is meant as a living treaty. And in his recent book, Bruce Morito postulates that the term process rather than event is then more appropriate for describing the covenant chain treaty relationship. So I really latched onto that today, July 31st, on the Canadian side of what we now call the Canadian side of the Niagara River, was when this belt was actually given by Sir William Johnson to the Western Confederacy at that time. So we're commemorating that, but at the same time, we actually, for 100 years after that, they gave us these presents, and the Anishinaabek accepted and abided by that as a framework for relationship building. So in fact, adopting a longitudinal orientation allows one to see that the Covenant Chain is a framework that evolved from an informal trading relationship to one of military, political, and economic alliance, eventually becoming a shared life world with a highly contextualized diplomatic language and semiotic set of symbols. How else can one explain the fact that wampum belts presented on the first slide were constructed by the British representatives for the Anishinaabek? So this is my time to make a plug, but I wrote an essay about the symbols that are on this belt and how they're informed by prior treaties, namely the Dish with One Spoon, as well as any other treaty about council fires, as well as treaties with using diamonds to represent the nation. So this medal here is actually part and parcel of the treaty. What I wanted to do when we go to Niagara tonight and tomorrow, what I was hoping was to actually bring the medals and the treaty together at that time, because these are both used as mnemonic devices to recount what the actual treaty was about. And here, for us, we end up saying that my primary source document is that petition written in Ojibwe, and that's the first three lines that they say in that. I still know how you talk to my ancestors when you bid them to go to war. That's what the first line of that petition says. Then the next line says, Nui kanash kawa maba wabe medabit gikitchigimi mawang. I will chase away anybody who comes to your great lake. And then the next line says, Ogana de bendan gadabano jimadakim away de wayanak. Gigano nadwaba nagitsimak. You said to my parents, my ancestors at Niagara, that your children will own that land over there. So those three lines, those are opening lines, and they said, I still know it. And the second thing they said, that at that time, you own this land. That's what they said, your children will own this land. So this belt represents Aboriginal title. And then the other thing they said, I will chase away anybody who comes to your great lake. And meaning that any fur traders or any whiskey peddlers or anybody like that that's coming there for trade to rip off the Anishinaabek, it was the Crown who said that they will chase away anybody who comes to bother us. And that's now what we call fiduciary responsibility. But back then, that's what the Anishinaabek called protection. We seek the protection of our great father. Oh, the last line there, it also comes to represent hunting and fishing and timber rights. Because at the end, you'll see, well, I hope to show it by the end, is that we didn't say that any of these other treaties that it would exclude us from actually selling fish or from selling timber or from selling anything. And what ends up happening is when you get these, from all these years, they're actually giving us guns, ammunition, balls, shot. They're giving us net thread. They're giving us cod lines, mackerel lines. For 100 years, they're giving us all the outfit to enact what we would now call our Aboriginal hunting and fishing rights. And then they pass the Game and Fish Act, and then they start confiscating our catch, confiscating our boats, and throwing our hunters and fishers in jail. So, of course, all this land was Anishinaabe. When I say Anishinaabe, in this case, I mean, instead of saying the red man of Peter Pan, I end up saying that it's all of us that own this land. So this medal here on the side was a medal that was given to friendly chiefs who didn't side with Pontiac at the time. So the friendly chiefs that didn't side with him, they ended up getting this medal, and the lion, of course, represents the British, and he's lying there nonplussed. And then here, there's a wolf there, and the wolf, they say, is trying to rile up the great lion. And they call it the Lion and Wolf medal, and they say this was when Pontiac tried, that mangy mutt Pontiac tried to rile up the king and his forces. So that's what these chiefs who were friendly to the British at that time, they got that medal. So here, this is about Aboriginal and British titles. So I told you that they actually said at Niagara that you will own this land. We acknowledge you own this land. And that's an Aboriginal title to us. But in 1761, actually, Sir William Johnson had tried to enter the Western Confederacy into the Covenant Chain. And he thought he had done it, but the vanity as well as the audacity of General Amherst quashed all of his efforts by 1763. So at Detroit, and note here that he addresses us as brethren, because at that time we had not gone through the adoption ceremony, where we started to address the king as our great father, and he addressed us as the children. So at this point in time, we're still calling each other brethren. And he says in council, I can with confidence assure you that it is not at present, neither hath it been His Majesty's intentions to deprive any nations of Indians of their just property by taking possessions of any lands. So he's talking about that they defeated the French, but we do not presume to take over all what they said that they claimed. All we do is we take over the forts that they had set up. He says all the land remains yours. So that's what this belt again represents, that they said, yes, we know you own the land. So that sets the backdrop to this, but what ends up happening there is that Sir William Johnson ends up gathering up all the nations again. He sends runners all the way out to Rainy River area and invites people, the Sioux, the Sauk, Fox, Menominee, all on the western shores of the Great Lakes, and they all come down. But they're kind of wondering if this is a trick, because they know that they were just at war with the British and that Pontiac is still at war with the British. So as we say, Anishinaabek, Penmanduan, Nidon, that they always depend upon the spirit. So what they did, and this was recorded by fur trader Alexander Henry, and they set up what we call a Giscon in our language, but in English it's been translated as a shaking tent. So they set up the shaking tent and they put the question to the spirit, will we be accepted as friend or foe? A wampum belt has been sent here inviting us to Niagara. So the one who comes in is, we call him a shikan, the snapping turtle. And he's the one who is the translator for the spirits to us. And he goes down and he comes back up. And in this world, the turtle's really slow, but in the spirit world, he's one of the fastest. So he comes back up and he says, Sir William Johnson has his fires ready. He's got kettles over the fire. You will be accepted as friend. And then they put another question to him, how many soldiers are there? And so again, the turtle leaves and he comes back. And he says, as I flew down the shores of Lake Huron, there weren't any redcoats. And even around Detroit, there weren't very many. And I went along the shores of Lake Erie, there weren't too many. And I got to Fort Niagara, there were many redcoats. And then as I went along Lake Ontario, and then I got to the St. Lawrence. And when I got to the St. Lawrence, there are more redcoats than there are leaves on the trees. And you would never be able to defeat them. So then that's what, informed by what the spirit had told them, they decided that they would then come down to Fort Niagara for this treaty. So Henry writes, he's coming back down, and he says all the villages have been deserted, save for a few old people and young children, and they're all gone to Niagara for this treaty. But the original Covenant Chain was supposedly given in 1673, as early as 1673, between the Dutch and the Mohawk on the Hudson River. And at that time they say that the Dutch actually said, we want to take you by the hand in friendship. And then they had said that it would be with a rope of friendship that we tie ourselves together. And they said things continued on well while we had our hands tied together in friendship. But the rope isn't very strong. So we cast an iron chain. And again, things progressed well while we were bound by this iron chain, but iron rusts and it isn't very valuable. Anybody can make an iron chain. So they said, after a while, we said we value our friendship. So we want to show that value, we make a silver covenant chain. And we know that when this silver is left alone, it will tarnish if it's left alone. So we said that we would get together every year and we would, for the express purpose of polishing that chain. And of course, the chain is the metaphor of the bonds of friendship. And of course, polishing the chain is actually having a metaphor for having a council to smooth over any disputes or any grievances that each side had. So one of the earlier representations of this covenant chain was that at either end, one was Anishinaabe, the other was the Jaganash, and then they held a belt or a chain between the two. And then there'll be variations of this. But here, this is the one that ended up being given to the Western Confederacy at Niagara on July 31st, 1764. And you see there they actually worked in links of a chain, and then the one represents the Anishinaabe and the other represents the Jaganash. And on that medal that I showed previously, they're sitting under a tree. And that's part of the promises that were recited. They said, you had told us that in the middle of your island, I will erect a tree. And under this tree, and where this tree stands, I sweep all around it. And then I lay out a mat there for us to sit under there and smoke. And they said also, I put a fire in the middle of your island. And I put beside that fire, and daton, a poker. So I put a poker beside that fire. And if you ever think your fire is going low or going to go out, stoke it. He says, Ni Jan Sedok, you stoke that fire. He says, because I piled beside your fire an ample source of wood. Gudwan Maba, thick. This log I piled beside their choice pieces of wood. And kai wika the ates no gudushkatemoa. Nanon dak jem nado ejegeno ninago. The Spirit hears how I am talking to you, and He knows that all that I have said will be true, and that your fire will never go out. Those are the promises that they made us at that time, and that's what this belt represents, is all that wrapped up in one speech. So Sir William Johnson ends up saying, brothers of the Western nations, I desire you to take fast hold of the same and never let it slip, to which end I desire that after you have shown this belt to all the nations, you will fix one end of it with the Chippewas at St. Mary's, whilst the other end remains at my house. So once he said that, then the Ojibwe chief got up, and he says, the Ojibwe chief ends up saying, this belt should not be kept at Sault Ste. Marie. It should be kept at Michilimackinac, a place of more prominence, a place more visited by all of our people in the area. And it should be kept with my elder brother, the Odawa. So that's how the Odawa people ended up becoming the keepers of this belt on behalf of the Western nation. And then that's how this belt, after the War of 1812 and the American War of Independence, how this belt eventually found its way to being kept on Manitoulin Island, where I'm from, as well as Lower Lee and Deb, where it was entrusted to the Odawa chiefs that moved there in 1836. Here are the 24 nations that were represented there at the Niagara, and you see it's a bit uneven the way it showed up, but on the Eastern Confederacy, representing the Eastern Confederacy, you got the Mohawks, Caughnawagas, Oneida, Conostatagas, Tuscaroras, Nanticoke, Onondagas, Kanois, Cayugas, Mohegans, Senecas, Algonquins, and Nipissings. But of course, the Caughnawagas and Conostatagas, their village was so big that they were counted as one nation each, but they're actually both Mohawk as well. And then on the Western Confederacy, it was the Chippewa, Tucumawans, which are actually Rainy Lake area people, Odawa, Huron, Menominee, Winnebago, Algonquin, Sauk, Nipissing, Fox, and Cree. Then afterwards, the Delaware, the Munsee, and the Shawnee would also be represented on this belt. So here again, perhaps you can't see it too well, but here there's 24 nations on that belt, and there's a ship there. And then the other represents the rock at Quebec. So this was the promise that was made by the British at that time, that they would always, this ship, they said, Kai wika naushkanesino mava manda gajimanawa. Your ship will never be empty. That's what they promised us. Gishpin Queen Wabindemek, if anything is lacking in there, you tell me. And then I'll go look for it. And then when I find it, I'll load it onto your boat. And then all 12 of you grab that cord, sabap zawangam, that strong cord of friendship, wikibidok gajimanawa, and you all pull that in to your shore, and you'll all be fed, you'll all be clothed as well. So those are the nations that were represented there, and what my theory is, but I haven't been able to prove this yet, is that only 24 of these large medals were given out to a representative of each of these different nations. And then also other medals were given out, but there's ones that are large, and then they said middling, and then small. And then there was one family on Manitoulin that had a small one, and people called them coins, but they had the they're not coins, they're medals, and they have King George III's face on one end, and then on the other side they got the coat of arms. And the Sywink family just ended up, their uncle ended up auctioning that off, and it was sold maybe 2 years ago. And it had the certificate that it was given to Odawa Chief Ego Mene, 1764, August 1st. And then on the back of that certificate, it actually had written each time that it passed from father to son or from nephew to uncle. So anyway, that's one thing we lost, and that would have been a good thing to bring to this gathering. So here are all the different types of materials that were given as part of this treaty. So you see they get all kinds of different cloth, molten, shrouds, calico, printed calico, Irish linen, striped cotton, coarse blankets, handkerchiefs, chiefs' lace hats, tobacco, ball, gunpowder, shot. So they would give us all kinds of things, sewing needles, thread, vermilion, and combs. And then the women would make the leggings, they would make the skirts, they would make the shirts. And here you see this one is a nice example of the ribbon work they used to do before they had a sewing machine. So here's the document that was written in Ojibwe, and you see June 27th, 1862. And in this, we don't say, the chiefs in this document, and they never say it was your fiduciary responsibility. And they never say this is our Aboriginal title. And they never say this is our nation-to-nation relationship. So our job as scholars and researchers and Anishinaabek is we have to try and understand this and learn this and see how they talked about it. Because when we talk about spirit and intent and we talk about Aboriginal perspective or Anishinaabe understanding, this is as authentic a form that you're going to get where it's written down in Ojibwe by the chiefs at that time. So again, the belt is shaken, as they say. When they say they shook the belt, that means that something went wrong or awry. And of course, it was the American War of Independence. So the nations, the Anishinaabe nations, Haudenosaunee nations, Cree, Sioux, Sauk, Fox, they continue to try and resist American expansionism. And then they side with the British at that time, and then of course they lose. As we know, history tells us they ended up losing. But the British agents keep egging on the Anishinaabeg to stay in there. So the 1783 Peace of Paris, and then in 1786, Sir John Johnson, who is the son of Sir William Johnson, succeeds him in his role as Superintendent General of Indian Affairs for British North America. So the belt was shaken. The Anishinaabeg are disillusioned with the British because they end up saying, how did you have any right to cede away all of our land? You don't even own it. How did this happen? So they're disillusioned with the British, and for a while they stop coming out to get their presents. And what ends up happening, the British get frightened because they think the Anishinaabeg are going to turn on them. So and that's when they decide they got to repledge this belt. So you see it says SRIIBT, but in Latin, the I's represent a J. So it's actually Sir John Johnson, Baronet, 1786. And now for a father to be succeeded in a government position by his son would be called nepotism. And nobody would allow that. But back then, that's how we understood, because our chiefs were hereditary. And this guy, the Anishinaabeg and the Haudenosaunee wanted him to be in his father's place. And of course, the king and queen, it was a hereditary line as well, so they saw no problem with that. So as I mentioned, when I was first invited, I thought the lieutenant governor was going to be here. And so I thought I'd take a bit of an emphasis on how they played a role in this, what their role was. So here we got Lieutenant Governor John Graves Simcoe, and this belt that he's got, he's pledged a belt, and my friend there, Brian Charles, made a replica of it, but the actual original is longer, and the original is kept at the National Museum of Natural History at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. So, Lieutenant Governor, the subtitle of my talk was Living Treaty and the Necessity of Corporate Memory. So what I think ends up happening is people that end up succeeding in the role of Deputy Superintendent or Superintendent General of Indian Affairs or Lieutenant Governor, they don't get apprised of the responsibilities. They have a total lack of knowledge about treaties that have been passed down, as well as the diplomatic nature of the discourse when they meet in council. So nobody brings them up to speed, basically. And now you see that, of course, where now all they're really looking at it as in a legalistic framework of, well, this treaty as an event was signed, and here's what it says in English. It doesn't actually look at what the Anishinaabe perspective of it was at that time. But to Lieutenant Governor Graves Simcoe's credit, he actually looks like he read all of Sir William Johnson's correspondence. Because at this point in time, in 1793, the Anishinaabek had, the Western Confederacy had actually had two significant battles where they defeated the Americans. They defeated Harmer and they defeated St. Clair. And these were big routs, the most significant battles and kills on American soil at that time, and probably still to date. I haven't checked that out though. But. So what ends up happening is the Americans start saying, you're provisioning the Indians to continue their war against us. You're giving them ammunition and shot. This is an act of war on behalf of the British. You are engaging in a war act by giving all these Indians ammunition. So he has to defend, Simcoe has to defend his actions. So he says, he writes a letter to his superiors on January 27, 1793. I have thus, sir, endeavored to impress by extracts from Sir William Johnson's opinions that our giving of provisions and necessaries to Indians as possessors of the posts is the result of ancient and undeviating system, not directed by temporary motives, and that the military orders of these posts are to give them on whatsoever account they assemble, such supplies as may be required. So he ends up telling them this is actually a long-standing practice. It isn't just because we have temporary motives to try and get the Americans out. So what ends up happening after the Battle of Fallen Timbers, the Anishinaabek are defeated by Anthony Wayne. And what ends up happening, the Anishinaabek end up retreating, and they retreat back to Fort Miami. And then when they get to Fort Miami, the British actually end up locking the gates, and they don't let the Anishinaabek in the gates to save themselves. So they end up having to fight the Americans on their own, and then they're slaughtered. And then this is the Battle of Fallen Timbers, and it basically ends what they call the War on the Ohio. So again, this shook the belt. They ended up being abandoned in the heat of battle by the British, and the Western Confederacy are like, what the hell is up with you? So, and then that actually translated that in Ojibwe. So he ended up, Sir Lieutenant Governor John Graves Simcoe ends up meeting the Western Confederacy at the Wyandotte town, which is Anderton, Brownstown on the River Detroit. And in council, he delivered a really long speech, but I'll just give you the main point here. In the treaty between the English and the conquerors and the French, it was stipulated that your rights should be preserved, those rights which you enjoy as an independent people. So again, the idea is that you aren't conquered. Lieutenant Governor Simcoe ends up saying, you guys aren't subjects of the crown. We know that. You are independent people. You are allies. Children, say, why has this friendship lasted so long? It is because the wisdom of your father appointed the late superintendent, Sir William Johnson, to hold a treaty with all your nations to consult what was best for your general and particular interests. Children, a line between you and the British colonies was then drawn agreeably to your pointing out an inclination. Again, this is supposedly the Royal Proclamation line. Children, the king's subjects were never suffered to pass this boundary, and it would have continued to this day had the king's people and those of the United States remained at one. Of course, he's stretching the truth there. Children, you must be convinced that your father means everything for your welfare. I can only assure you that he will uniformly fulfill all his engagements with you. His arms will at all times be ready to receive you, and his territory open to protect and defend you from all his enemies. Children, the king, your father, has always advised you to be strong and unanimous, and at present it is requisite for me to repeat his constant advice to you, which is to unite as one man. With this belt, therefore, I now collect and bind you together, and recommend to you friendship and unanimity, which is absolutely necessary as well for your own interests as the general welfare of the country. So that's the speech that accompanies this belt, and again, he makes specific reference to Sir William Johnson and the Treaty of Niagara. So that's the main point that I'm trying to show here, is that after Sir William Johnson dies, the treaty doesn't die. It isn't just a one-time event. His son takes over and his son repledges it, and then his son is still alive, his son is still the Superintendent General, but it's the representative of the Crown in Upper Canada, Lieutenant Governor Simcoe, who ends up making another pledge to strengthen that belt. So again, in 1806, a deputation of Sauk, Fox, Northern Ottawa, and Potawatomi bring a war pipe to Amherstburg, Fort Malden, which is south of Detroit. And they bring this war pipe and they say, we're ready to go against the Chimokmonuk. That's our word for the Americans. We're ready to go against the Big Knives. And they wanted to fight them. And then the British did not want to go to war yet, to open war. So they ended up in 1807, William Klaus ends up giving a belt, which is on that table, well, not the real belt, but a replica of that belt, which is on that table, and he says, this is to tie your men down, to have them sit still. So he's the Superintendent General of Indian Affairs, but then they thought that maybe it would have more force if it came from the Lieutenant Governor. So again, this is Lieutenant Governor Gore, and here I found this sketch in the Klaus Paper Archives, and he said that he was going to construct a wampum belt. And you see it says FG here, and then it says black, white, black, and it has a heart. So again, they're giving us belts, but they end up changing the belts, and they introduce new symbols like this Valentine heart. We never used to have the Valentine heart. The way they say we would represent a heart would be two diamonds that are overlapping to represent the two chambers of a heart. But we use that straight line all the time to represent the path of peace and good intentions, the undeviating road. Now, of course, you hear our elders talk about the Red Road or Anishinaabek Road, but that's the same thing what they talked about. So in 1808, Lieutenant Governor Gore's speech to the Western Confederacy at Amherstburg, children, it's been my wish and desire for a considerable time past to meet you in General Council of all nations, that I may personally assure you of the King, your father's constant regard for his Indian children, and to tell you that the treaty made at Fort Stanwix in the year 1768 is still held sacred by your great father, as well as the treaty made by General Simcoe. Also to renew at this fireplace the ancient friendship which has subsisted for so long a space of time between your great father, your ancestors, and yourselves, and eventually and freely to communicate to each other in conformity to the engagements entered into your forefathers and the English nation. With this belt, I therefore renew all our ancient friendship and those ancient customs which have been so wisely framed and agreed to by the general consent of all the nations in the country. Children, I came not to invite you to take up the hatchet, but I wish to put you on your guard against any attempt that may be made by any enemy, whatever, to disturb the peace of your country. Children, make my words known and send this belt of amity and friendship to all the Western nations and others who are confederate with you. And then it says, gave belt 11,550 grains. So we just had this sketch, and we had known that it was actually, the belt consisted of 11,550 grains of wampum. So I got my buddy to make that belt, and I'll show that to you later. So again, the Anishinaabek lost their land, and during the War of 1812, well, during the War of for the Ohio, they were promised, this was what was held out to them, that along the Ohio River, west of that, all the way out to the Mississippi, would be an Indian country, or a buffer state, they called it. So this is what spurred on Tecumseh, as well as other chiefs, our chief being Neebalkum, and then also the Odawa chief of Siganok. So after the war started, the Earl of Bathurst had written on December 9, 1812, the extreme importance of securing during the continuance of hostilities with America, the cordial cooperation of the Indian tribes has been proved on so many occasions. I so entirely concur in the expediency of the suggestions contained in your dispatch as to the necessity of securing their territories from encroachment that I have submitted to His Majesty's Secretary of State of Foreign Affairs in order that whenever negotiations for peace may be entered into, the security of the Indian possessions may not be either compromised or forgotten. So again, he's recommending that when they end up having peace, that our land is restored to us, whatever we've won, and that whatever rights we had and privileges before then, that actually stays. So of course, at this time, Brock and Tecumseh have had a significant battle, significant victory at Detroit, and then also Michilimackinac was taken, and these all bolster confidence in Upper Canada as well as with the Western nations, and even at this point with the Haudenosaunee, because the majority of the Haudenosaunee did not enter into the battles early on. So in order to try and get more to this cause, to the British cause, they ended up, General Brock ended up being killed, of course, at Queenston Heights. And then what ends up happening, he's succeeded by General de Rottenberg. And General de Rottenberg then writes out a speech, and he has a wampum belt made, and he sends a runner. He ends up sending a fur trader by the name of Robert Dixon to go to all the Western nations and to proclaim and to try and actually get them to participate on the side of the British. So again, the other thing, the main point again, he says in this speech delivered with wampum, "My children, remember Sir William Johnson. He told you I never would forsake or abandon you. I have not, nor will I lose hold of the belt which has been so long among you. On the contrary, I will now make it stronger by the belt which I now present to you. And never will I leave you, but as your fathers see that justice is done to you by the big knives, and that your hunting ground shall be preserved for your use, and that of your children, agreeable to the treaty made at Grenville with their General Wayne some years ago." So that's the actual official speech that is made by the Lieutenant Governor or Governor-in-Chief at that time, General de Rottenberg. And again, he makes express mention of the Wampum Treaty of Niagara and Sir William Johnson. So Tecumseh and his Confederates were all into this and wanted to have this actually achieved. And of course, Tecumseh was killed as well. So with Tecumseh killed, they wanted to actually get as charismatic and dynamic a leader to fill his shoes. And so they looked to his son, Pokisi. And so General Prevost at that time, who's the governor-in-chief and of both Upper and Lower Canada, they end up sending a deputation saying that he wants an audience with Tecumseh's widow, Tecumseh's sister, and Tecumseh's son. And at this particular meeting, he gets these epaulettes, armbands, medals, a sword, and a red scarlet coat. So that's why I think that in this painting, this is Tecumseh's son, because he's got the epaulettes, he's got the medals, and he's got the armbands, and he's got the rifle. But of course, the painting is, the artist wasn't the best. So General Prevost ends up saying that he just wanted those three to come out. But what ends up happening, a deputation of the Western Confederacy come out, and then a representative of the Six Nations also come out. So you got chiefs from the Fox, Sauk, Ojibwe, Odawa coming out with the Shawnee as well at that time to represent the whole Confederacy, not just that family. So on March 17, 1814 at Quebec, Prevost had written out a speech, and then he had actually delivered wampum again. "My children, listen to my words. They are the words of truth. Our interests are the same. We must still continue to fight together, for the King, our great father, considers you as his children, and will not forget you or your interests at peace. But to preserve what we hold and recover from the enemy what belongs to us, we must make great exertions, and I rely on your undaunted courage, with the assistance of my chiefs and warriors, to drive the big knives from off all our lands the ensuing summer." So he had big plans. "My children, you will not forget what I have said to you. This is my parole to the nations," and here the black wampum was presented. "Let them know what I have said. Tell them they shall not be forgotten by their great father, nor by me." Here the bloody belt was presented. So whenever they went off to war on the warpath, they would paint the belts red with this vermilion. They would make the vermilion would be a powder, and they would add water to it, and then they would paint that belt, and they would say, now we're at war. And only when war ceased would they wash that belt clean. And then they would say, you washed the belt clean, and now we bury the hatchet. So you've all heard of the term bury the hatchet. But this was how, so he presented again wampum to continue for the Western Confederacy to continue on the war path. So the next lieutenant governor ends up being General Drummond. And these are actually war clubs that are in his collection, as well as these two pipes, and there's pipe stems as well, and they're at the Canadian Museum of Civilization. And we, at the Ojibwe Culture Foundation, when I was there, we were able to borrow that, put on a display, an exhibit of the, and these are like pledges. When a warrior or war chief comes up to a soldier, a British soldier or a war chief, and he presents his war club, he's telling him, I'm going to fight for you. So that's what ended up happening there. So, of course, the Treaty of Ghent is signed on Christmas Eve, 1814, and they didn't have the internet back then, so they didn't know, nobody heard of the cessation of hostilities until late February. And then on March 3rd, at Burlington Heights, where now a dump truck is stuck on the bridge. At Burlington Heights, on March 3rd, 1815, General Drummond delivers a speech to both the Western Confederacy and the Eastern Confederacy. The Haudenosaunee are there, the Anishinaabek are there, the Delaware, Munsee, Fox, Sauk are there as well. So he says, Chiefs and warriors, I salute all and will begin by following your ancient customs. I therefore make use of these strings of wampum to dry and wipe away the tears from your eyes. And of course, this is a symbolic use of wampum because you can't possibly dry somebody's eyes with a shell from the ocean. And to drive away from your ears all noise that might cause uneasiness among you, to calm your minds and ease your hearts, that no object of distress or affliction may disturb your seeing, hearing, and receiving favorably all communication made to you by your great father, the king's officers. The inevitable consequences of war leave everywhere blood of the wounded and killed and reminders of the loss of warriors. I now wipe away the blood and gather together the bones in order to rid them from your sight. I have not received the treaty, but once I do, representatives will be sent and particulars communicated to you, and that the ceremony of condolence shall be finished with a belt agreeable to your ancient customs and manners. So again, another belt was going to be presented by the governor, the acting governor, on behalf of the British nation, on behalf of the Crown, to the Western Confederacy and the Eastern Confederacy. And again, it referred back to this original relationship. It wasn't a whole new relationship. It wasn't a whole new treaty. So they end up getting the treaty, and this is William Close, who's actually the grandson of Sir William Johnson. And he succeeds his grandfather's position. He's the Superintendent General of Indian Affairs. And he ends up getting a belt, making a belt, and you see this belt at the bottom. They call it a Greek key or the swirl. And what Rick Hill told me, who's a Seneca, that his elders had said it represents a whirlwind and represents how destructive the path of war is through a community that leaves everything in disarray. But I guess the pattern is called the Greek key. So the 9th article of the treaty is the only time we're mentioned in the Treaty of Ghent. It says, the USA engaged to put an end to hostilities with all the tribes or nations of Indians with whom they may be at war at the time of such ratification, and forthwith to restore to such tribes or nations respectively all the possessions, rights, and privileges which they may have enjoyed or been entitled to in 1811 previous to such hostilities, provided always that such tribes or nations shall agree to desist from all hostilities against the USA, their citizens and subjects, upon ratification of the present treaty. So that's what the actual treaty says, the Treaty of Ghent, the 9th article. But at Burlington on 24th, 1815, April, William Close actually says, I am further instructed to inform you that in making peace with the government of the United States, your interests were not neglected, nor would peace have been made with them had they not consented to include you in the treaty, which they had at first refused to do. That's true. I will now repeat to you one of the articles of the Treaty of Peace, which secures to you the peaceable possession of all the country which you, quote, possessed before the late war, and the road is now open and free for you to pass and repass without interruption. So he actually added this phrase, which is actually key, because now we look at, all of us put big stock into this Jay's Treaty, that we have a right to pass and repass the border unmolested. But here he actually gives us a wampum belt, and he tells us by the 9th article of the Treaty of Ghent between the United States and America that you have the right to pass and repass unmolested through the country. So he actually added pass and repass. That's not in the treaty, but that's what we are told. And now when you look at any kind of treaty litigation, they look at the record of what was actually said in council as well. So that's what we were told, and that's what we believe to this day. So again, the presents from 1764, of course, just when they're going to go to war, that's when the presents are all the more finer. You get a higher quality of presents, you get a bigger quantity of presents. But then when there's no war, no threat of war, then the amount of presents are lessened, and then the quality are cheapened. And in fact, right around this time, they gave us these medals, different medals at different times, 1815, 1814, and they were solid silver. And then around 1840, they started giving another medal, and it actually was like that $2, the toonie, you know, when it was really cold and then the center would pop out. This actual medal had two silver, it was silver plated, so I don't know what was in the middle, but they put two silver coverings over it, so it was an encasing, and then when the chief would walk, it would rattle. That's how cheap it was. So I read of this, the Indian agent at Manitoulin says the chiefs complain about the quality of the medals, they make a bit of a noise in their... So I just kind of laughed, and then here it turns out that the Royal Ontario Museum has one of those in their collection. I put all these medals together that they had and lifted them up, and I was like, hey, I think this is, and then he kind of goes, this isn't a real loud ring, but it does ring. So they're getting cheap. They want to cut costs. They always want to cut costs when it's the Indians. And so what they ended up doing, this fella, his name is Sir Francis Bondhead, and he's pictured here on your left. He actually made his name in London, England, by cutting costs to what they would call, what is now called the Welfare Act. So he was able to successfully cut costs in London, England. So he ended up being more or less what we now would call headhunted to come here and cut costs in the Indian department. But he was also a famous travel writer. So he went down to Bolivia, he went to all these different places, and he would write books about it. And his main competition actually at this time was Anna Jameson Bromwell. Maybe some of you have read or heard of her. Anyway, these two end up getting in a bit of dispute about that. He becomes a knight, and how he ends up getting his knighthood, nobody had seen anybody work a lasso before in London, England. So he gets a royal audience, and he brings a rope and he starts doing lasso tricks with that, and they make him a knight. So he ends up becoming called Baronet Francis Bondhead. So he was told once he got the position in January 1836, he was told what his instructions were. So he writes back to his superiors, because he knows nothing about Indians other than romantic views, and he's coming to Canada for the first time. So when he says, he hears that there's always a gathering at Manitoulin Island where they deliver the presents, which are blankets, guns, ammunition, and all kinds of different cloth. He says, it is my intention to attend this most important meeting, and I trust I shall by that time be competent to give your lordship an opinion on the first question upon which I am to report, namely how far it may be practicable with good faith and sound policy gradually to diminish the amount of presents with a view to the ultimate abrogation of the existing custom, and whether in the meanwhile they might not be commuted for money payments. With respect to the second question, namely what reduction could be effected in the establishment of the Indian Department, I will report upon that when I have determined the minimum to which the department can be reduced. So again, he's going there, he says, well, I got to cut costs, and I'll see how much of these presents I can actually get away with doing. And this is when, I believe, when they first started calling this a custom. So he actually officially calls it do away with the custom of giving Indians presents annually. Of course, it's not a custom, it's a provision in a treaty. So this is the subtle wordplay that starts to happen. So he shows up, and this is Chief Jean-Baptiste Siganak, Odawa chief and interpreter for the Indian Department. After the War of 1812, he distinguished himself during the War of 1812, and they gave him a blue admiral's coat and a cockneyed hat as well as the high black boots. And I know it's him because somebody wrote on the actual painting, a Siganak. So he ends up, when Bondhead comes to Manitowoc, when all the Anishinaabek are there, he tells them that, we're going to reduce the amount of presents that are given, and any of you Anishinaabek that are from the United States coming here for presents, in 5 years, you're no longer going to be able to do so. And if you're a woman and you've married a non-native, you're not going to be able to get these presents either. So they had this kind of long-standing will to cut and to cut down the numbers as well. So when the Siganak brings these belts out in front of him, and he says, "My children, I clothe you." This is what Sir William Johnson said. "My children, I clothe your land. You see that wampum before me, the body of my words? In this the spirit of my words shall remain. The Indian being my adopted children, their life shall never sink in poverty." So that was what the oral tradition was at that time. They always said, "Your children, you told us we would never sink into poverty." And of course, you see stuff that's happening at up north, like at Attawapiskat and other reserves as well. So I just complemented that with a quote from Sir William Johnson back in 1764. He says to the Western Confederacy, "The English will deal fairly with you. They will treat you kindly and trade with you honestly. You will grow rich and happy, and your brothers contented, so that our union cannot be shaken." That's what Sir William Johnson had told the assembled chiefs there. The other way that they actually said this and how it was codified in that letter written in Ojibwe, the chiefs had said, "This is what will happen to you. And then Abian Gautagijik, as you look about all the sky, Nandawabandan Gadabano Jimo Binmatsuin, when Jimok said Jesus. Look for the life of your children where the sun rises. Kowap Ma Jesus Jimasquap Gagojing, and you will see a sun rising red. That is the image of the life of your children. This is Naachashpiming Jesus Gibagojing, and as that sun gets even higher, Apchidawasakoza, it will be shining brilliantly. That is the image of the life of your children. And it says, Naach swimming, Nage what Jesus. And even higher that sun will go. And as the sun gets higher, the rays of the sun will touch all of the earth. And then in different places, flowers will bloom, flowers will appear. That is the image of the life of your children. So of course they're promising us prosperity, sunny, happy days, and a tiptoe through the tulips. So now we gotta help that happen again. So this Bondhead is so enamored with this, and he's so impressed with the Siganak's recollection of these wampum belts, and he's so impressed with how all the Anishinaabek are there. And he, of course, like I said, he's a travel writer. Then he says, let's make a treaty. So of course, the funny thing about this treaty is that the way it's written, if you read the treaty, it says the British relinquished their title to this land. Of course, they had no title to it. And then he says, do you, Odawa and Potawatomi, do you, Odawa and Ojibwe, also relinquish your title to this? If yes, affix your signature to my proposal. So they do it. Then one smartass says, well, who owns the island then? Because everyone gave it up. But the first line, and I think this is the only written treaty that actually references the 1764 Treaty at Niagara. The first line says, 70 snow seasons have now passed away since we met in council at the Crooked Place, Niagara, at which time and place your great father, the king, and the Indians of North America tied their hands together by the wampum of friendship. Every other treaty starts off with "Know ye by these presents," forthwith they end up talking about indentures and ceding land. But this treaty is unique in that it says 70 snow seasons have now passed since we tied our hands together in a wampum of friendship. And so we look at this treaty as being a stronger treaty in our eyes here. And then they wrote in another petition afterward, "Meanwhile, dashako nishtana ashe mingudwa sweko the sobobona got meanwhile ngibe disagona chigama." And then it was 26 years ago, this is in 1862 when they're writing this petition, they said it was 26 years ago when the Chigama, meaning Bondhead, had come here. Ngibe zongtamagana manda na ministamina je opposite de bendamong ni nwe Anishinaabek. And he told us in the strongest terms that we are the absolute masters of this island. So that's their recollection of the 1836 treaty. So again, the Anishinaabek view this as a treaty that is continuously evolving, and that every year that the British come on our shores, to our land, bringing presents, they're enacting and fulfilling the precepts and the principles of that treaty. So they do this at Anishinaabek, they do this at St. Joseph's Island, they do this at Drummond Island, they do this at Penetanguishene for 1 year, then they do it again at Manitouwading from 1836 to 1854, and then that's when they are finally able to cut that out altogether. And then they also do it at Fort Detroit, Fort Niagara, Fort York, Kingston, and Quebec. So here's a long-standing Indian agent. His name is Thomas Gummersall Anderson. And he's by this time, they're still trying to get rid of all the Indians again. And they're trying to cut the expenses that they have and all these obligations that they have to Anishinaabek, not just Anishinaabek, but the Haudenosaunee, anybody. They're trying to cut the costs all the time. So they're always sending these reports out to the Indian agents in the field, and they ask them all these different questions. So the question was, with regard to those resident within the settled portions of the province, what lands have exclusively been appropriated to or reserved by them, and by what right and in what form that have those appropriations and reservations been made? This guy, he could speak Ojibwe, and this guy actually fought with the Anishinaabek during the War of 1812. He fought at Prairie du Chien, and he fought on the Western Front with them. So he knew Anishinaabek intimately, and by this time, 1840, he had been their superintendent for, who's good at math, 25 years? Yeah, 25 years. And here's his answer. The Indians have no record of past events. All they know of the original engagements between the government and themselves, as far as I am acquainted, is by tradition, except 2 memoranda, wampum belts, which they hold. The one being a pledge of perpetual friendship between the North American Indians and the British nation, and was delivered to the tribes at council convened for the purpose by Sir William Johnson at Niagara in 1764. From the Indian tradition, on account of it, a written explanatory document was delivered with them, but it is not now forthcoming. After the death of Sir William, his son Sir John Johnson succeeded his late father's situation and renewed the pledges in 1786 by depositing with the tribes another belt of the same kind. These are the only records amongst the Indians within my knowledge. So again, he ends up calling them memoranda instead of treaties. So again, there's this continual diminishment of the terminology of what these actually are. And then they always end up calling them, they want to do away with the custom of giving Indians these presents, but it's not a custom. So this guy was well versed in what they would call woodland diplomacy. He knew whenever people would get up and talk. And he knew how they would talk in Ojibwe, and he knew how they talk about, there's a lot of different speeches where he had to write down, and then he would put parenthetical remarks beside it to say what the chief actually meant. He says that if the chief wrote, there's dark clouds that were coming while I was passing on my way here, when I passed the fort at Anishinaabek, a dark cloud was over there. And then he put in quotes, meaning that the Americans were threatening him to not come here to get his presents. So this corporate memory is there on the ground in the field. But then actually when you go up to higher stations within the bureaucracy of Indian affairs by the 1840s, especially by 1850 and 1860, the corporate memory is really not as strong as it was before. And of course, this is because of the diminishment of the role of Anishinaabek as warriors, needed as warriors. But interestingly, during the Upper Canada Rebellion, they actually sent another wampum belt up to Chief of Siganock, and then that Chief of Siganock took it west to Sault Ste. Marie and then down into Larbour Cross to get them ready if they needed to send the Anishinaabek warriors down to quell the rebellion. So again, when they needed them, then they would give these wampum belts, but when they didn't, they just entered into these texts. So this is, for us, an infamous treaty, 1862 treaty, and beside the treaty with the signed clan signatures, there's a fellow named William McDougall who is the father of Confederation, and at this point in time, he's actually the Commissioner of Crown Lands. But in 1861, 2 treaty commissioners were sent up to Manitoulin Island. Their name were Bartlett and Lindsay. And then they actually came up and they told the chiefs and council, they said, the 1836 treaty is invalid. And it was invalidated because in the treaty it says that 9,000 Indians would come here and live. Clearly, there are not 9,000 of you living here. Therefore, the treaty is null and void. And even further so, they said, you don't own the land. You don't own this island. What claim do you have to own this island? That's what Bartlett and Lindsay were saying in 1861. So the government regrouped and they said, well, through the King's benevolence, we'll offer you 25 acres per head of family. That's what Bartlett and Lindsay said in 1861. The Indian agent worked from October all the way to the summer, and he worked on individual chiefs, and then he wrote to his superiors and he said in 1862, if more favorable terms were offered, let's say 100 acres per head of family, maybe some of the chiefs would sign the treaty. So that's how they ended up dividing and conquering to get the Manitoulin Treaty signed. But what ended up happening, they said, and also he recommended, instead of sending 2 treaty commissioners who do not know much about this, it would be better if you actually sent the minister or the commissioner who has the authority. So the Anishinaabek were really suspicious of those other 2 guys that came up. They just thought they were private individuals. So they sent the Commissioner of Crown Lands, one of the fathers of Confederation here. And then when he offered his terms, one of the chiefs, I suspect it was Jacques Talgewanen, got up and he says to him in Ojibwe, you spoke of a perfectly beautiful white bird. And I just picture this guy sitting there and he's like, what the hell is this Indian talking about? That there's a white bird somewhere. I came here to get land. I came here to get a treaty. But what actually they said in that petition, he says, Ni John Sadik, Pukod Nan Doshton, Chishpad Nak. He says, I make here a high hill, and I make it very high. Mi dashje gaje asak o beneshi shigen dagazit wapshkizit. And on top of that, I put a perfectly beautiful white bird on top of that mountain. And he says, and at my house, I too will keep a perfectly beautiful white bird. And at my house, I make another mountain, very high, where this white bird will sit. And if I have anything to say to you, I will tell my white bird. And if you have anything to say to me, you tell your white bird. And he says, and further, I'll make a road. I make a high road between our 2 countries. And so now that's what we say, we have proper channels of communication between, and we would say that it's through our nation-to-nation relationship that the perfectly beautiful white bird could be the Minister of Indian Affairs, but back then it would have been the Governor General or a Crown Representative. And our end, I believe it's the Odawa Chief who is the keeper of the wampum belt. So this is our representative and our nation-to-nation relationship. So it is Jacques Talgewanen, and then it gets up at this treaty council and says, you spoke of a perfectly beautiful white bird who I should relay my thoughts to concerning my land and my ownership. And he says, I'm happy to see you here, that you brought your white bird. So this guy must be just befuddled at what the hell is this guy talking about? Mountains and birds and and stuff like that. So then they also said they would call it, like I said, they would call it support and warmth. And here, this is actually a painting of Manitoulin Island done around between 1845 and 1850. And the reason I know that is because this is a painting of George Ironsides, and he had red hair and a red beard. And then, like I said, a Siganok, they wrote that it was a Siganok, so Siganok's still alive. And then here, this is Samuel Jarvis Peters, or Peters Jarvis, sorry, who Jarvis Street is named after. And he was part of the family compact, and then he was Superintendent General of Indian Affairs, but he ended up getting into quite a bit of trouble due to his sloppy bookkeeping. There were charges of actually misappropriations of funds and stuff like that. And then that kind of first tarnished the name of Jarvis Street. Just kidding. So this building, it might still be standing there, and the Anishinaabek actually still own a plot of land at Manitowoc. But you see all the Anishinaabek, and Anna Jameson writes in 1837 that there were up to 3,000 Anishinaabek gathered there. There were Ojibwe, Odawa, Potawatomi, of course, but there were also Menominee, she said, and Ho-Chunk, who is commonly called Winnebago. And you see how far these guys came. They came from Green Bay, Wisconsin, to come and get their presence here and to fulfill the role of this treaty. But here you see all the cloth piled up, and you see the first two row have gotten their disbursements already. So that's what they said. There was one more thing you promised. I give you this boat. This boat will never be empty, they said. That's what they promised us. So here, these are extra articles that they would give us at different times. Guns, common guns, chief's guns, rifles, kettles, tin kettles, fishing hooks, cod lines, net thread, Russia or Scotch sheeting, and that's like a canvas that we would use for our sailboats, as well as for our canoes, or even to use over our tents. So bear that in mind, that they're giving us these implements. And then they turn around and they pass the Fish and Game Act. And then they start throwing us, our fishers, in jail. They confiscate his catch. They take his net. They even take their boats. So at a Grand General Council in Garden River in 1869, they wrote a petition. And they said, we met in Grand Council, and then they forwarded this petition to Little Current the following year. We met in Grand Council at Little Current on the 25th of July, 1870, for the consideration of that sacred friendship which have existed between our forefathers in the year 1764, at which time a wampum belt had been made by the British government as an emblem of that sacred friendship, which is now before us in our assembly. And after long deliberations, we came to the conclusion to renew that sacred friendship by having smoked the pipe of peace as a token of perpetual friendship between the different tribes and bands assembled. Great Chief, we would therefore humbly ask and entreat your Excellency to have the said sacred friendship renewed, as we do in our part, by respecting our rights to the lands, hunting and fishing which are virtually ours, which the Great Spirit have given us many 100 years before the white man set his foot upon this good and delightful country of ours. Great Chief, we sometimes think that the said sacred friendship is not held so sacred as when first made, as we have some grievances that we wish to mention to your Excellency for redress. So when they're addressing the Excellency, that's the Governor General. By this time, the Lieutenant Governor is succeeded or superseded by the Governor General. That's when they start addressing all their concerns to the Governor General. So the specific concerns that they have, they said that Indian Affairs sent commissions to induce us to surrender our property, that the Game and Fishery Act make us liable to suffer imprisonment or fines, that when we remove anything from our reserve to sell, we are liable to the same punishment, meaning fines or imprisonment. Gradual Enfranchisement Act does not suit us, though some clauses are suitable. The islands of the North Shore or Georgian Bay and Lake Huron were not properly surrendered. So you see how they referred to this belt, and they tied all their grievances as being a contravention of the principles set out in that belt at that time. So the chiefs continued to adhere to this Treaty of Niagara, not just in 1764, but all the way even after the British stopped giving us presents in 1852, 1854. They tried to keep having this Treaty of Niagara, the Wampum of Niagara, to be in force long after. So they actually said they weren't listened to, of course. Then they said, we didn't receive a response to our petition, so we're going to go to Ottawa. And then if we're not heard at Ottawa, then we're going to go to Quebec. And if we're not heard at Quebec, then we're going to England. And then they actually received a written response, and they said any Indians going to Ottawa or Quebec or England will not receive an audience. And if you do so, your expenses will not be covered. And of course, they hold the purse strings to our funds, the Indian Management Fund. So they had another Grand Council again at Garden River, and this was in 1879. But then in 1881, they have another one where they're going to send a deputation. So in this petition, they said they were told by their great father, the king, he would not always live to look after them and their rights, that after his decease, efforts might be made by evil-disposed persons to deprive them of their presence. And if they were ever so unfortunate as to lose them, all they would have to do would be to present the treaty, meaning the wampum, and the medal, which I give to them, to my successor in the throne of England, and both the covenant and the promise would be speedily and faithfully carried out, and the presents restored to them. So the chiefs all this time expressly tied the medal to that wampum belt, and that those two actually represented the Treaty of Niagara. And here in 1879 and 1881, they actually tried to get that reenacted, or not reenacted, but adhered to and followed. But again, they were denied an audience. And then there's 4 different stories of what happened to the original belt. The original belt used to be in Mantuani. One of the stories is there was a hotel called the Queen's Hotel in Mantuani, and it had a large coffee table, and the coffee table had a glass top, and under there laid the wampum belt. And then that hotel burnt down. So that's one story of what happened to the original wampum belt. The other story is that it was buried with one of the chiefs of Wikwemikong, Louis Odogojuan, or that might be wrong. And then the third, but it was supposed to be buried with the chief. The third story is that a family still has this, and they'll bring it out at the right time. And then the fourth story, I was told by a curator at the Signac Museum, is that he actually saw the original belt at a museum in Chicago. And I said, the Field Museum? And he said, no, one of these smaller rinky-dink museums. And I said, well, what was its name? I don't remember. And I was like, Bo, you just don't want to tell me, because you know I'm going to go there and get it. So anybody going down to Chicago, have a look around, see where these belts might be. Me gwech gi bizin demek kene enchiek nam dabiek gijinam apchgo gijinam de nongo. It's really humid and warm today, but I thank you all for listening and for sitting here the whole time. Me gwech.